In the previous lecture, we began to examine 5 features that draw together Proverbs 25 through 29. There we saw that there was a 4-part structure revolving around a unifying question with 3 answers. Secondly, we saw how those 3 answers work together to form a cohesive whole. And now the third point is evidence that a monarch's perspective spreads across Proverbs 25 through 29. The concepts of monarch, courtier, and magnificence recur at strategic points across the master lecture that spans Proverbs 25 through 29. We'll consider each one of those, beginning now with the monarch's perspective. Mention of kings appears early in the introductory sublecture, that is 25, 1 through 12. The monarch stands central to the wisdom commendation of 25, 2 and 3. And this, except for the editorial preface of verse 1, is what inaugurates the entire master lecture. Here the sage establishes that authentic magnificence associated with kings ultimately is a derivative of their engagement in the wisdom enterprise. So kings plus wisdom produces magnificence. That's verse 2 of chapter 25. In verse 3, we learn that kings possess a unique capacity for that very activity, engaging in wisdom. Only the divine outranks them in the wisdom enterprise. That's also in verse 2. Even the seemingly incidental editorial preface of verse 1 draws our attention to the monarchy, both by naming that role and by recalling by name 2 kings associated with wisdom's discovery and its transmission, namely Solomon and Hezekiah. As well as occupying that first wisdom commendation, verses 2 and 3, the monarchy proceeds also to dominate the first wisdom content, verses 4 and 5. The pivotal role of this introductory content becomes even clearer when its last hemistich, namely, thus through morality may his throne be established, that is verse 5b in chapter 25, when we see that this last hemistich corresponds closely to the final line of the lesson wherein the monarch at last receives the expanded consideration, that is the 4th master or 4th sublecture. Listen to these words from chapter 29, verse 14, which closes the block which charges the king to fill his role as just judge. We read in 29:14, a king who faithfully administers justice for the helpless folk, his throne will be established permanently. Very similar to 25:5, thus through morality may his throne be established. The poet thus links the introduction comments about the monarchy and the expansion comments about the monarchy, chapter 25, all the way down to 29, very tightly together. If one were to broaden the field beyond the literal word king to encompass also management more broadly, then reinforcement would appear at various points. In the first sublecture, one would note the term great ones and a synonym for leaders. And in the second sublecture, the word leader itself. Great ones is in 25:6, leader 25:15. When we come to the fourth sublecture, there are several. Officials, 28:2. The verb to rule, 28:15. Prince, 28:16. Ruler, 29:12 and 26. And the term officers, 29:12. Thus we see there is evidence of a monarch's perspective at various points across Proverbs 25 through 29. The fourth link involves evidence of the perspective of courtiers that spreads across Proverbs 25 through 29. Courtiers, or those aspiring to a place in the royal court, figure prominently in the introductory sublecture, particularly chapter 25, verses 5 through 10. There, the sage warns against two negative behaviors that courtiers may fall into, which in turn prove to supply a dual theme introduction and an envelope structure that plays out in the second sublecture. The first courtier figure to appear in the introductory portion is the greedy self-promoter. That's chapter 25, verses 5 through 7. Second is the courtier who too generously takes up another person's litigation without assessing its legitimacy. In the second sublecture, the sage instructs the courtier concerning 7 characters or relationship scenarios that he may typically encounter. These span 25:13 through 27:4. What's interesting is to note that the first of these 7 is a fellow who arrogantly, or we may say greedily, misrepresents himself. He shows up in 25:14. This parallels closely the first character of the courtiers in the introduction, the greedy self-promoter who puts on airs before the king and presumes to occupy positions of prestige that are not rightfully his. We encounter him in 25, verses 6 and 7. Thus, the first of the 7 relationships in the expanded courtier portion recalls the first of the courtier dual themes that we find in the sublecture, the greedy, pompous self-promoter. The last of the 7 characters in the expansion, the second sublecture, is the seductively litigious fellow who angles to draw others into advocating for his legal cause. We meet him in chapter 26, verses 17 to 28. This character recalls the second of the 2 courtiers in the dual theme of the introduction. That cautioned against presumptuous advocacy for someone else's legal case. We meet him in chapter 25, verses 8 to 10. All 5 occurrences of the Hebrew root meaning to litigate, the word riv, that occur within the master lecture all across 25 to 29, all 5 of those appear either in the dual theme introduction about the litigious fellow or in the 12-verse exposition of that same fellow, which is the last of the 7 courtier relationships. To summarize, the first sublecture's introduction of A, the greedily pompous courtier, and B, the courtier who too generously advocates for someone else's litigation, these 2 operate as dual theme introductions and create an envelope structure by occurring at the point of the first and last of 7 characters cataloged in the second sublecture, that is, the one that expands on courtiers. This brings us to our 5th master lecture link. Evidence that magnificence as a concept spreads across Proverbs 25 through 29. The concept of magnificence weaves through the master lecture both in specific terms and by metaphor, often at structurally strategic points. Consider the term glory, which appears twice in the initial wisdom commendation opening chapter 25. There it's associated not with wealth, but with God who caches wisdom, and with monarchs who then ferret out wisdom. We're referring here to chapter 25, verse 2, the first statement following the editorial introduction. In the first wisdom content of that initial sublecture, the sage establishes that a leader's glory does not remain static like a frozen asset, but it may be enhanced, or metaphorically, it may be refined by extracting from within it what is immoral, what detracts from it. That's in 25 verses 4 through 5. The sage concludes the introduction by explaining that this process of refining or enhancing glory has not reached full potential until the rare and refined metal has, through the jeweler's skill, been deliberately and painstakingly fashioned into a finely crafted artifact. The jeweler's crowning achievement, and hence the monarchy's most splendor-enhancing resource, consists of reproof that both must be administered in a manner sensitive to surroundings, that's the message of 25:11, and as well it must be embraced with sincere receptivity. That's the message of 25:12. And that closes the first sublecture. The term glory will appear again in chapter 26, verse 1, where it is line terminal. That is the last word in the Hebrew of that verse. That's a verse that opens the portion spanning 26:1, reaching all the way to 27:4. So it's a pivotal opening verse. Glory also appears within a palistrophe that spans 26:5 to 12. Within those verses, glory appears at the pivot point, the hinge point, that is 26:8. Incidentally, just as glory was line terminal in 26:1, it again is the last word of the line in 26:8. Two double references to the word glory, or more accurately to the underlying root kaved, occur in parallel structural cadences. Here's what we mean. There are two cumulative recaps, each of them 4 verses long. The first is in 25, verse 25 to 28. The second is in 27, verses 1 through 4. Within those two 4-verse cumulative recaps, notice the third line. So in the first cumulative recap, that would be 25:27. In the second that we're referring to, it would be 27, verse 3. Here's how 25, verse 27 reads. To eat a large quantity of honey is not good, but to search out their glory is glory. We'll come back to talk about whose glory that is. That is a very, very weighty, significant message here. But notice there is double use of this very pivotal term, glory, within that one verse, and it's the third verse of a cumulative recap. When we come to the second cumulative recap, we're focusing again on 27, verse 3. Notice how it reads. We find there double reference to heaviness, or something being heavier. We want to keep in mind in the Hebrew that glory and heavy both trace to that same root, kaved. Here's how 27:3 reads. A stone is a heavy load, and sand is a burden, but a fool's angry response when wronged is heavier than them both. In all likelihood, the sage purposely used that term heavy or heavier so as to evoke the notion of glory in the ears of his native hearers. But he's referring to this kaved in a form that would lack the luster associated with glory. It is only heavy without being splendid. The root kaved appears strategically positioned in 27:18, which reads as follows in the second hemistich. And one who guards his master will be given glory. There, kaved occurs line terminal, closing the reproof teaching that spans 27:5 to 18. This is quite near the end of the second sublecture, since all that remains after verse 18 is the final cumulative recap, spanning 27:19 to 22. This pattern of locating a kaved term in line terminal position immediately before a 4-verse conclusion, like we saw right there in 27:18, This will occur again at 29:23. The last half of that verse reads, "But it is lowliness of spirit." The last half of that verse reads, "But it is lowness of spirit that will lay hold of glory." Just before launching a 4-verse conclusion that ends the entire master lecture, that 4-verse conclusion is 29:24 through the end of chapter 29. Just before that, the sage refers to glory as he issues this concise guide to any who quest after magnificence. This pattern of locating a kaved term in line terminal position immediately before a 4-verse conclusion, this pattern occurs again at 29:23. Here's how verse 29:23 is located. Just before launching a 4-verse conclusion that ends the entire master lecture, those 4 verses are 29:24 through 27. Just before that, in 29:23, the sage refers to glory as he offers the following concise guide to any who quest after magnificence. This is thematically an absolutely enormous principle occurring here towards the close of the master lecture. It reads, "A mortal's loftiness will bring him low, but it is lowness of spirit that will lay hold of glory." 29:23. The magnificence metaphor associated with precious metals and their refinement, which we first saw in 25:11-12, recurs several times in the master lecture. You could find them in 26:23, 27:21, and again 27:24. The reference to metallurgic refinement that we find in 27:21 in the following verse extends by analogy to the refinement of grain products, 27:22. Even the caution against immoral pursuit of wealth, and think of wealth as an attractive element in magnificence. The caution against immoral pursuit of wealth, this occupies chapter 28, right across it, serves to accent the luster of magnificence, which by contrast is authentic. How does it do that? The sage shows that pursuit of wealth exposes the hollowness of splendor that is merely monetary. Pursuit of wealth which has been procured at an exorbitant ethical cost. So it appears magnificent, but that's only superficial because the ethical cost was too high. The sage then shows that is a dead-end way to try and acquire magnificence. A final synonym or word in this general notion of magnificence would be the verb to sharpen that we see in 27:17. It reads, "May iron by iron grow sharp, and may a person sharpen the face of his friend." Since to sharpen means to raise the value of a raw product by removing inferior, dull constituents, this idea of sharpening also speaks to the larger theme of improving or enhancing magnificence. This concludes our exploration of various elements of cohesion that unite Proverbs 25-29. Now we are free to concentrate more particularly on the first of the 4 sub-lectures that comprise this master lecture, namely 25:1-12, Counsel for Kings and Courtiers who are in quest of magnificence.